my body is the entire cosmos. It's not just a skin-bound body. And so, we were talking earlier about how animals have group souls. Their ego is in some sense outside of them. Their ego is the environment, and they sense their ego as if it was outside them, whereas human beings have the ego inside of us. But, I think the challenge for us in our materialistic cultural epoch is to not just imagine that the I, that our sense of self-consciousness is our private possession, but to experience it as a gift from the cosmic periphery. Our existence, our being is a gift from the environment. And we need to get in touch with our animal nature in a sense, but we don't want to just revert to that sense of immersion in a group soul. We need to recognize that our own egos are a gift in a way that also empowers us to be individuals, and that it's a as Barfield would put it, it's final participation, not original participation. Or as Gebser would put it, we're stepping into the integral. We're not resubmerging ourselves in the archaic. And so there's a kind of freedom required here.
Not just in the sense of liberation, but in the sense of a kind of creative agency and moral agency and intellectual agency.
Whereas before it was just a cosmic necessity. Now
the training wheels are off.
There's a freedom involved in our own recognition, and
if there's a transcendental guarantee, it's us.
Our own acceptance of this fact that our own individuality is a gift from the cosmos. Because there's a certain attitude that's like individuality is so important. Like we can't, like I'm all about non-duality and Advaita and stepping into a more unified form of consciousness, but we can't lose our individuality in that. But I feel like we maintain our individual freedom at the same time that we recognize this deeper form of communion by experiencing our own individuality as a gift and accepting, like receiving the gift and really saying thank you, like you've given that to me, and now I have the responsibility to live up to that, to step into that recognition of being one with everything.
Oh yeah, okay, all right. There's all kinds of directions I could take this in. All right, so well, this one thing that I should mention here, I think, is that earlier when we first started chatting, I was talking about like a self-conceptualization and actually conceptualizing the self itself as a kind of transcendental object or eternal object or an ideal, right? In the very fact that it is a form. It is also a kind of ideal, a form. For a form to actually manifest in the world, it has to take a multiplicity and unify it.
The soul is the organizing principle of your body. It's the organizing principle that holds multiplicity together. And so that has to be connected to body. It's not like something that exists independently. A soul is an organizing principle. A soul is a vector of unity and multiplicity. Now, the notion of body, you could stretch it.
My body is the entire cosmos. It's not just a skin-bound body. And so
in a sense, the form of selfhood itself is kind of the metaform. It's kind of the monad in a sense, because it's the form of unity as such, without any kind of other specifying content. And there's a really interesting relationship here, I think, between subjectivity, let's say, in this much more kind of cosmic sense, and physicality, the sensory matter bodies. Because Steiner talks about the way in which we like, when we're thinking of things in physicalistic terms, we like to think of everything as these bodies that are defined by like weight and extended surfaces, right? So like a barrier which divides objects from one another, right? And if you look at like Hegel and Zizek, the way that they talk about subjectivity as this thing that kind of carves itself out of a background, as it were, that in order for there to be a sense to the feeling of the feeling of I am, there has to be a kind of negation that happens. There has to be a kind of like, I am, and so I am not, whatever is beyond that boundary, right? And so it's like the initial boundary between internality and externality is that primordial feeling of the form of forms, the metaform, the monad, the ideal of unity itself, which then creates this kind of division. And then you look at physicalism, and you've got this thing where we're taking this idea of little BBs, little concrete physical objects, which are defined entirely in terms of their self-identity. When we think of a physical object, that's exactly what we think of. There's this boundary between the inside and the outside, and the physical object sustains its identity against that of other objects. And so there's a sense, I think we can say, in which this physicalist paradigm, in a way, it's actually taking subjectivity, reifying it into this fundamental principle of matter, and then projecting it out onto everything. So like with the way that we think about like heat dynamics or fluid dynamics, our mathematics treats it as though all fluids and all gases and all heat are just these little BBs bouncing around. And every one of those BBs you can see it as kind of a projection of the basic contents of subjectivity itself. And so even beyond the ways in which that might be misplaced concreteness, to what extent is it not misplaced? To what extent is there something about bodiliness itself which is actually a concretization of the basic form of subjectivity? If hopefully that made some kind of sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. The self as the metaform, the form of forms, as it were. And I can't help but, so there's a Christian impulse in me and a Buddhist impulse in me here. Like to think of the self as the be all and end all. And then to think of the self as empty, actually. It's like the self is the form of forms, or the self is emptiness. The Christian and the Buddhist path. And these are just different ways of talking about the same thing. But I'm not fully satisfied with that relativism. I feel like, am I going to say it? I feel like Christianity transcends and includes Buddhism in a way. I mean, I agree with Steiner. It's hard to disagree.
Yeah.
Christ is, I think, in some ways a more forceful energy. It's more about form and metaform, yeah. Whereas Buddha is more about emptiness. And I don't want to lose sight of either of these poles for a second. It's crucial to maintain the tension between emptiness and form here. But form fucking wins, obviously. Otherwise, I wouldn't be seeing you, you wouldn't be seeing me, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. Form wants to be.
Within all human, spiritual, metaphysical, intellectual traditions, you have a division between transcendence and immanence. And within the Western tradition, that is conceptualized in such a way that transcendence is form and immanence is formlessness, right? And so you see this in Plato's Chora, you see this in Plotinus's discussion of matter as the kind of darkening of form, right? And then on the other hand, with the Eastern tradition, you have transcendence conceptualized as oneness and immanence conceptualized as separation. And so they mirror one another in this really interesting way, because that oneness is like you said, is an emptiness. It is a formlessness. And in Plotinus, I love Plotinus's discussion of this. It is so fascinating because he's taking Plato's notion of the chora and he's really hammering down on this question of what this is, this emptiness that somehow has to be a receptacle for form in order for there to be anything at all. There has to be this negation. There has to be this nothingness, this emptiness, this abground, groundless ground, right? It has to be there somehow. So what is it? Because it doesn't fit into the traditional Platonic scheme where it's like you've got forms which are conceptualized through noesis, and then you have the bodily world which is experienced through sensation. And this formlessness is somehow neither. So what could it possibly be? The way that Plato talks about this, he says, well, it's got to exist somehow, but however we cognize it, it's got to be some kind of bastard reckoning is what he calls it, because it can't be the perception of form or sensation. But I think what you find here is this intersection of form and formlessness, literally and on an intellectual level within Christianity, because then subjectivity itself has to be that, right? Plotinus says this. He says that whatever this chora is, this emptiness, he almost chastises it. It's almost like he's like, how dare you? Stop being so bad, darkness. I need you to conform to this metaphysics of light that my boy Plato created. But he says this thing that is so illuminating, pun intended. He says, whatever darkness pretends to be, it is not. Whatever it tells you, it's lying. He says that the formlessness, the chora, the emptiness, it is in a sense the form of mere apparentness, right? And so reality versus appearance within Platonic cosmology. So what would apparentness be? It's experientiality, right? And that's exactly what we see in the Buddhist traditions and all these Eastern traditions, that the condition for the possibility of being aware of anything is awareness as such, right? The emptiness which preconditions that. And so what that then implies, I believe, is that subjectivity itself, that I amness there, right? The burning bush, it says to Moses, I am that I am. And that phrase has been interpreted in all these different kinds of ways. But then immediately after that, Moses says, well, then which God should I tell the Hebrew people sent me to them? And the bush replies, tell them I am sent you.
The bush replies.
It's subjectivity itself.
Mhm.
That's exactly what it is. And so that means that Christ is the incarnation of that. And that means that the awakening of Christ within is recognizing that our own subjectivity itself is that. It is the most primordial kind of intersection of form and formlessness. So, okay, I got way too excited there, so I'm going to shut up for a minute. But yeah, this is something I've been thinking very hard about lately, if you can't tell.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the Heros Gamos that's at the core of Plato's Timaeus, right? Between the intellect, the nous, and the receptacle, where you need form and formlessness or emptiness to create a cosmos. Cosmogenesis is the interplay of these poles. And in Plotinus, you have the one beyond being. It's beyond the intellect. You can't even think it. You just dissolve and are no longer. There's nowhere and known anymore. You're one with that which is, and then at the very bottom of Plotinus's emanational scheme, you have matter, and matter is, just as the one is beyond being, the one is in a sense formless. Matter is also formless, and there's this weird coincidence of opposites, I think, already evident in Plotinus, and Plotinus renders this as a, an outflow and an inflow, an involution and an evolution, and so there's a going out from and then a return back to the one in Plotinus. But I think that's just his way of making sense of the strange correspondence between the one and the one and matter, or the one and the many, if you want to put it that way. And so when we think about the body, when we think about materialism, and I mean the whole, I think, spiritual import of Christianity is the incarnation, and the way in which the body, the matter, the earth becomes so important, becomes so crucial and central. That's what God wanted to save. The body, human, embodied, mortal existence, is what God wanted to value as the highest possible reality. And so, like, the Christ event, we think, is incredible for us as human beings to believe in. And like Tertullian was like, I believe because it is incredible. So this idea of like faith and reason often is like, well, yeah, we know it's absurd. But it's not just absurd for human beings that the incarnation happened. It's absurd for the gods. It's absurd for the spiritual world. They're like, wait, Christ did what? he's the sun being became an earth being? Like, why? And I mean, love and freedom is the answer to why, which is, I think the rest of the spiritual world very quickly caught on to why Christ did it, because of love and freedom, which is something that only mortal human beings could be capable of. And so the spiritual world entering into the material world through this deed of, the Christ being it's a kind of cosmic inversion, and it happened very recently in the history of Earth, in the history of the whole cosmos. And we think of Christianity as some kind of old religion, and it's old for us as skin encapsulated egos, because it's, oh my gosh, 2,000 years. It's like one, maybe two incarnations. Like we really need to expand our sense of time to be a little bit more long term here.
We're just beginning to get acclimated, or even just beginning to recognize what it is that we're supposed to be getting acclimated to. Because I mean, it's like there's something utterly absurd about Christianity, and that is the power of it. It's very interesting that, in the early days of Christianity, there were certainly the more intellectual mystics and whatnot, but a lot of early Christianity was just normal people who really were just operating on this kind of gut instinct. They just experienced it, which is itself really incredible. But I think it also resulted in this world in which, you have millions of people walking around every day who call themselves Christians, and they say that they believe the things and that they're, doing what they're supposed to do, and they have absolutely no idea what Christianity is.
Belief and knowledge, like you have to come to this Christ event through science, after science, like not before. You can't, it's not something to be believed in, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, it's a mystery, but the connection here with science, in a way you could say that science, or maybe even more specifically physicalistic science, is this compulsion that we feel as a kind of aftershock of Christianity to like confront that darkness of matter, of the bodily world, and somehow reckon with it. And so Heidegger, within the question concerning technology, and actually this is really just a theme throughout a lot of Heidegger's later work, well, and Being in Time, really just his whole career, this idea that this idea of enframing, this idea that we're taking that which is of nature and we're abstracting it out of the life world through Vorhandenheit, and we're transforming it into this standing reserve. And if you really back up and look at what Heidegger's saying through the lens of Plotinus, what Heidegger's saying is that modern left brain Vorhandenheit intellect is trying to dematerialize matter, is trying to suck the darknesses out of it, the indeterminacy, the aphanopoiesis, the chaos, the all the things that Plotinus seemed to be like morally chastising when he talked about the prima materia. Materialism, ironically, seems to be trying to transform matter, ironically, into these perfect crystalline embodiments of our most abstract ideas, which is to say mathematical ideas. So materialism, rather than being this thing that over affirms matter, in a sense it's exactly the opposite of that. It is a war on the body, it is a war on materiality. And it makes you wonder then, okay, well, if that's the case, then what would happen if science wasn't at war with matter? And it could actually make friends with matter, you know? And I feel like in a lot of ways, that's what Steiner...
Yeah.
That we need to stick with that which is actually present, that which is actually there in the phenomena, instead of getting lost in our abstractions and then trying to slap that grid onto the world the way that Newton and others have done.
Yeah, I mean, the Goethean method of doing science is, like you were saying earlier, harnessing empathy as a way of knowing, as an organ of perception, falling in love with matter. And when you fall in love with matter, you see that matter is full of form. Matter wants to express itself. Matter wants to communicate itself. Like, matter is the medium through which spirit communicates. What else could it be? And it's not about rejecting or turning away from it, but embracing it, really. Alan Watts used to talk about, like, materialism as we usually think of it actually doesn't really care about matter at all, because it leads to this form of architecture that's so dead and alienating, and it treats matter like it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly.
And if we really cared about matter, we would create a more beautiful world than the world that industrial civilization has produced. And so it's like,
I don't know matter personally, but I have a feeling it's not into being turned into strip malls, just on an intuitive level. But then again,
yeah.
I'm joking, but we definitely know matter personally. I mean, what do we know more personally? And Nietzsche, this is where Nietzsche comes in, despite the fact that Nietzsche kind of fell into the abyss of his own ego. Nietzsche was also a guy who absolutely hammered on this point that, when we go down this Cartesian road and we say, like, oh, well, I could be a brain in the vat. Like, shut up. No, you can't. You definitely have a body. Here are your hands. Like, you exist. Like, this is what is more certain than your embodiment. If you're calling that into question, then you're completely lost in the clouds, because you've fallen in love with your intellectual fantasy world. And that's one thing that Nietzsche was preaching against the entire time, that this will to escapism, it's not just dangerous, it's fueled by all of our worst impulses, our sense of inadequacy, our feelings of resentment. Those are all there in our will to get the last laugh by flying off into some kind of puffy cloud heaven where, we don't have to deal with existing in these dirty, malformed bodies, and we don't have to deal with our boss and our family, and it'll be this nice, perfect, pristine world where everything's okay. Or we could embrace life. We could actually say, you know what, this is actually pretty cool. Let's keep doing this. And I definitely don't think you can be an actual Christian without affirming that. And that's one of the things that made me feel really iffy about figures like Seraphim Rose. He might have been a brilliant person, but at the same time, even through the darkness, even through the labyrinthine belly of Ahriman, we're here to enjoy the ride, not to die alone in a cabin, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Confronting the great mother that is formlessness, that is Gaia and whatnot. And so anyway, Heidegger, he kind of ends up feeling very, very alienated